Hey everyone, this is Amanda from Devotion in Action. Welcome to the last week in our Witnesses series. I'm here at the end of the book of Genesis with this printable of Joseph and really kind of focusing in on the end of the life of Joseph. Joseph's life is kind of recorded in chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis, and I'm really kind of focusing in on the very end of his life here. And I'm using that largest printable, had to fold it over a little bit to get it to fit into the spine of my Bible because I have this really great big space at the end of this book on this page. So it's nice to have kind of a larger scale printable. If you don't have to use the hand in yours. You can just use his torso and body. I thought this was kind of a neat, like a hand of blessing out toward his descendants. That we're starting in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 through 26. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And then there's a subtitle in my Bible that says the death of Joseph. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. And they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And again, that's Genesis 50, verses 19 through 26. Joseph's story is a long and fascinating one. It spans, like I said, the chapters 37 through 50 in Genesis. He made very many admirable choices, but he also endured persecution, betrayal, unfounded accusations, jail time, and more. Our focus scripture is about the end of his life as he transitioned from running his spiritual race on earth to being one of those witnesses in heaven cheering us on. Joseph's perspective on the events of his life is remarkable. I've met so many people who have experienced hard times and developed bitter views on life or resentful attitudes towards those that they believed were responsible. However, Joseph can look back on his life with a kingdom perspective, seeing the good that came out of his personal pain and forgiving those who caused his hardships. Remember, Joseph's brothers were the ones that told his father that he had probably been killed by an animal. Meanwhile, they stripped him of his coat and put him in a pit, and then when slave traders came along, they sold him into slavery and sent him to Egypt. And yet, when he encounters them later in life and they are coming to ask him for help, they don't realize it's him at first. Joseph says to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. That was the beginning of our passage in Genesis 50. He could have folded in on himself in anger and bitterness, but he chose to see his circumstances in light of what God was working on in his life. So Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, and he went through lots of stuff. You have to read the chapters. His life is very fascinating. But ultimately, he ends up orchestrating and managing the storing of food during plentiful years, because a massive famine was coming to the land, and not just to Egypt, but to the surrounding countries as well. And so his family has to come and during the famine and try to buy food from the storehouses that Joseph had managed, and through through his management of these resources during the good years, it provides food that saves the nation of Egypt and the people who come and purchase food from Egypt. And so God brought about all of this good and the saving of lives through the evil that his brothers had planned. Joseph's choice to see his circumstances in light of what God was working on in his life helped heal his family, protected the entire Israelite line, and provided for their future. Joseph lived to see his descendants to the 4th generation before he died. He got to see his family live and thrive in the best part of the land while in Egypt. However, when he was about to die, he reminded his family that God would bring the Israelites out of Egypt and back to the land that God had given them. He makes them promise to bring his bones with them and bury them in the promised land when they go. Even in death, he secures a place among his people in the promised land and an inheritance for his descendants. And it happens. It's recorded in the book of Joshua after Joshua brings God's people into the promised land. Joshua 24 verse 32 says, "As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph." Like in Joseph's life, God's perspective can help us frame our circumstances with a view to how God is at work in our lives. We can see how he is working all things for the good. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." So my challenge as we're watercoloring Joseph today and as we're reflecting on his life and this passage in Genesis and how he saw his life through the lens of God's perspective, how he saw it through, like he framed his life through this idea that God was bringing good through his personal pain. How do we see our lives today? Are we focused on the painful events and the struggles of this world? Because we know that in this world we will have struggles. I mean, Jesus told us that in the Gospels. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And he brings our peace, right? So are we viewing our circumstances through the lens of God's faithfulness to keep his promises? Or are we seeing them as like, it's the end and I'm a victim and this person was horrible for doing this thing to me, you know, kind of thing. Are we seeing those struggles and those problems as something that God can use to bring about his eternal purposes and good results, even though the things that are happening to us are negative? So I'm not saying that everything that happens in life is good. That's just not true. I mean, there are very painful, bad things that happen to people in this world and in this life. But God, in his mercy and in his compassion, can take those things that are bad and those things that are painful and use them to bring about good results and bring about his eternal purposes. And so the way that we look at our pain, if we're following the footsteps of Joseph, says we may not be able to see it in the moment, but God is already at work in my life. So this week, let's work to find God at work in our lives and frame our view of our circumstances, good or bad, with his perspective, to see that God is faithful to keep his promises and to really trust in what he is doing in our lives in the midst of any struggle or pain or difficulty. As we are watercoloring Joseph here, you can see that he's, you know, at the end of his life, he's 110 years old. He has some lines and some wrinkles on his face that have to be, you know, watercolored in, and he's wearing kind of a darker blue sash that echoes the color of the sky behind him. on over his tunic, and that is just that repetition of color is always really, really good for to make artwork pleasing to the eye. When we have repeated colors that happen, it's pleasant to view. So this one is a fairly large image, and there's quite a bit of I don't know, dimensionality that needs to be worked into it. Even though I want this turban to be kind of a white turban, I have to add in some kind of color that's going to create those shadows and those folds that create dimensionality in the fabric. And I chose to do that with the blue rather than with like a brown as we did in a past one. So it doesn't really matter which color you use. You can choose whatever color you want as long as you're pretty consistent, and you do it lightly and then kind of blend it in, so it creates that dimensionality where you feel like you see those folds, see the fabric moving away from you, that kind of thing. And then coming in over that light coat on the sash that he has going across his shoulder, and bringing in some darker colors on that as well. Just building in that dimensionality and those folds of fabric is really nice. So just kind of softening those up just a little bit with a slightly damp brush, but keeping the darker tones there so you can see how that fabric kind of is moving and folded in the watercolor piece. So the hand needs a little bit of work here also, adding that dimensionality, smoothing out harsh lines, and creating those shadows that would naturally be there if he was holding up his hand. I also felt like the hair is just a little bit too one-dimensional. There's just one coat on that, so it's coming in with a darker color and adding in those strands, and that movement of the brush is pretty quick, and I'm lifting up at the end of it to create a smaller, thinner line at the end of it. So pushing down at the beginning and lifting up at the end will lessen the amount of paint on the page as you're pulling out toward the end of that stroke. I'm trying to think how to describe this as I'm saying it, and it creates the wispiness of the hair that way. So that stroke of the paintbrush is push down at the beginning, lift up at the end. But I'm not pushing down super hard at the beginning either, just kind of just a little bit harder than at the end of it. It creates those strands of hair and gives his hair a little bit more realism and dimensionality as well. And then just softening up those wrinkle lines and those places where he would have shadows on his face, because they were a bit harsh. And anytime I get it spreading too much or it's too dark, I'm just taking a paper towel and blotting that up, and then I can redo it. I love watercolor, so forgiving, yay! So it's interesting because even in creating art, we can choose to view it through a lens that frames what we're doing. So you may look at your art, and sometimes I look at my art and I think, oh, this could be so much better. It's wrong here, 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 and here, and I wish that this looked like this, or I wish that I could do what they do. And I can focus on those things, or I can look at it and say, okay, God is really developing something in me that I've come a long way from where I couldn't draw a stick figure that looked like a stick figure. And he has been working on me, and not only artistically improving, but also like building up his word inside of me that transforms me from the inside out. And so to frame our art in the lens or in the perspective of what God is at work in our lives doing, and not comparing it to someone else's art or thinking that it's not good enough, but God is at work in us as we are creating in response to His Word, and just spending time marinating in His Word. He is softening our hearts. He is building our faith. He is encouraging us to step out and take action. And these are things that as we take little steps toward Him, He transforms us and creates a beautiful masterpiece out of our lives. A beautiful masterpiece out of our lives. So as you are creating this art and any future art that we do, as we're finishing up this series, I just want to encourage you that it's not about how great of an artist you are. And some of you are really fantastic. Some of you, I'm like, ooh, that was a good idea. I need to do more like them. That some of you are really awesome, and you have a skill and a talent level there. But some of you maybe don't feel like you measure up. And all of us need to remember that's about opening our lives up to what God is doing inside of us, and kind of frame our Bible art journaling in that perspective. Like, how is this helping me to draw closer to Him and become more like Jesus, more like what God describes in His Word, more like these witnesses who are cheering us on? Am I running that race faithfully? Am I loving others like John did? Am I framing my life like Joseph did? Am I a man of passion and using any personality that God gave me and skills and talents like Paul? So thanks so much for joining me for this series. Let's go forward and run our race.